They never plan to wake up with thoughts of you filling their mind completely. This is the first important thing you need to understand. Most people are not as strong as they try to appear. Deep inside, they carry things they have pushed down for a long time, using all their effort, all their control, and all their determination just to keep moving forward without facing what they truly feel. Over time, intensity begins to take hold of them. What looks like indifference on the surface is often just silence, hiding something much more complicated underneath. At first, this inner struggle is not obvious. It seems quiet, almost invisible. But it is never truly calm. It is more like a hidden fight happening behind a controlled expression, a battle they are slowly losing, even while they pretend everything is fine. You may have already sensed it yourself. That small shift, that subtle change in energy, like something unspoken was starting to grow under the surface. It was not just distance, and it was not confusion either. It was something deeper, something more serious. It was the mind beginning to recognize what the heart was trying to deny. People do not easily accept emotions when they first appear. Instead, they push them away. They question them from every angle. They try to explain them, reduce them, or shut them down completely. They hide them under logic, under ego, and under carefully built emotional walls that were created over many years just to stay in control. But this is where the real conflict begins. When a feeling challenges someone's self-image, they resist it even harder. The more powerful the emotion becomes, the more forcefully they try to suppress it. This is what creates internal pressure. And pressure never disappears on its own. It builds quietly until it finds a way to surface again. What they refused to accept yesterday slowly becomes what influences their thoughts today. Without realizing it, they start to move differently, think differently, and react differently. Not because something new appeared, but because something inside them finally shifted in a way they can no longer ignore. That is why some mornings feel different for them. Not because something external changed, but because something internal reached a breaking point. A silent collapse of denial. Not seen by anyone, not spoken out loud, but deeply experienced within. If you have ever been the person they could not stop thinking about in that quiet space, then you understand this moment. In those silent hours, when distractions disappear, your presence returns. Not as a memory they control, but as something that rises on its own, without permission. Attraction alone is easy to dismiss. Curiosity fades quickly. But emotional depth is different. It stays. It returns. It interrupts thought patterns that were supposed to be stable. And at some point, it forces a question that can no longer be avoided. Why does this person affect me so strongly? They try to answer it with logic. They tell themselves it is temporary. They label it as coincidence, timing, or simple chemistry. Anything that feels safer than the truth, because the truth is harder to accept. You do not struggle this much with something that means nothing. You do not fight this hard against something that is not real to you. Every attempt to remove you from their thoughts only makes your presence clearer. Every distraction they rely on eventually loses strength at the exact moment they need it most. This is not weakness. It is the mind reacting to something it cannot fully control anymore. Deep down, what scares them is not just the feeling itself, but the loss of control that comes with it. They were used to managing their emotions, controlling their reactions, keeping everything contained within a predictable structure. But you disrupted that structure. Not intentionally, but simply by becoming something they could not easily explain or dismiss. You became the factor they could not solve, the presence they could not fully ignore, the thought that returned even when they tried to move away from it. And that is what creates fear, not of you, but of what you awaken inside them. This is why their behavior becomes inconsistent. One moment they seem distant, the next moment they are mentally present again. It is not lack of care, it is overload. feeling more than they are ready to process at once. Avoidance is often misunderstood. It does not mean absence of feeling. It often means the feeling is too strong to handle directly. So the conscious mind tries to step back, while the subconscious continues to hold on, replaying moments, rebuilding thoughts, and bringing your presence back again and again. Over time, denial becomes harder to maintain. Distance stops working the way it used to. Even without contact, even without presence, something about you remains active in their mind. Clearer, stronger, harder to push away. At a certain point, a feeling stops being uncertain and becomes something they internally recognize as real, even if they refuse to fully admit it. And once that shift happens, it changes everything. Thoughts become heavier, silence becomes louder, ordinary moments begin to carry emotional weight. When the mind can no longer fully deny what it feels, it begins to split internally. One part tries to move closer, the other part tries to pull away. One part feels drawn in, the other part tries to protect what it believes is safety. And neither side is willing to fully surrender. This is not simple confusion. It is internal conflict between desire and self-protection. And the more it continues, the more exhausting it becomes. Because the same feeling that pulls them toward you also makes them step back at the same time. That contradiction follows them everywhere. It enters quiet moments, ordinary routines, and unexpected pauses during the day. Even small things can trigger thoughts of you without warning. A sound, a silence, a pause, a familiar feeling in an unrelated moment. At this stage, you are no longer something optional in their thoughts. You are part of their internal landscape, whether they accept it or not. And that creates a question they can no longer avoid. Why you? Out of everyone, why you specifically? The more they search for logical answers, the less satisfying those answers become. Because what they are experiencing is not purely logical. It is emotional recognition that does not depend on explanation. It simply exists. And when something reaches that level, avoidance stops reducing it. Instead, it amplifies it. Distance does not weaken it anymore. It strengthens it by removing distractions that used to keep the mind occupied. So they stand in that space between knowing and resisting, aware of what they feel, but not fully willing to act on it, recognizing it, but still trying to control it. And that tension continues to grow quietly in the background of their everyday life. Not because the feeling is fading, but because it is becoming harder to ignore with each passing moment. This creates a constant psychological pressure that never fully disappears for them. It keeps building slowly in the background, tightening over time until something inside them eventually has to give way under the weight. They are not only dealing with the feeling itself in their heart, but also with what that feeling reveals about them. It exposes hidden needs, quiet fears, and things they usually avoid facing about themselves. What they feel for you points directly to a deep desire for connection. A need to feel understood, seen clearly, and emotionally safe with someone who matters. At the same time, it brings out another fear inside them. The fear of letting someone affect them this strongly. Because once they are affected at this level, it means they are no longer fully in control of their emotional world. And that loss of control feels uncomfortable. It creates resistance inside them. So they keep shifting back and forth. One moment they move closer emotionally, allowing themselves to imagine what could happen. And the next moment, they pull away mentally, trying to protect themselves from going too deep. In one moment, they see hope. They imagine a future that feels warm, simple, and possible. In the next moment, they convince themselves it is too complicated, too risky, or not the right time. This constant switching is not random at all. It is a form of internal protection, a way to feel something real without fully surrendering to it. But you cannot stay half connected to something that affects you this deeply. Sooner or later, it demands to be faced fully, and every delay comes with a cost. Emotions that are pushed down do not disappear. They transform into tension, restlessness, and mental noise that becomes harder to ignore over time. At first, they may have been able to manage it. But lately, that inner noise has become stronger. It follows them into daily life. It affects their focus, their patience, and even how they react to small, unrelated situations. Sometimes it shows in their mood changes, in their irritability, or in how quickly they become overwhelmed by things that normally would not affect them so strongly. Something unresolved inside them is rising more often now. It appears without warning and demands attention. Even when they try to stay composed, something underneath is no longer staying quiet. And if someone were to ask them honestly, they would struggle to explain why certain thoughts keep returning. Because it is no longer just about emotion. It is becoming something deeper, something that touches their behavior, their attention, and their internal stability. There are moments when everything seems fine on the outside. They appear calm, controlled, and unaffected. But underneath that surface, something is shifting. The real change is happening where no one can see it. In the part of them that no longer fully believes the distractions they use to stay away from the truth. Repression always has a cost, and that cost always returns later. The longer something real is pushed down, the stronger it comes back when it can no longer be contained. What once felt manageable now feels intrusive. What once felt distant now feels close and unavoidable. The mind does not stay silent forever when something matters this much. Eventually, it pushes back. It breaks through in thoughts that interrupt focus, in emotions that feel sudden, and in reactions that seem stronger than the situation itself. They may notice it in their own behavior. Small things starting to irritate them more easily. Moments of distraction that feel unusually intense. Thoughts of you appearing without warning and pulling their attention away from whatever they were doing. At this point, you are no longer just someone in their external life. You have moved into their inner world. And that changes everything. Because external things can be avoided or ignored, but internal presence follows them everywhere, even into quiet moments, even into rest, even into the times they try to escape their own thoughts. Their resistance is weakening, not because the feeling is disappearing, but because it is becoming undeniable. The real question is no longer whether they feel something. That part is already clear inside them. The question now is what they are going to do about it, and that is where fear begins to grow. Because action means vulnerability. It means exposure. It means stepping into something they cannot fully control anymore. Most people try to avoid this level of emotional risk. Because once something has changed you internally, you cannot simply return to how you were before. Something in them has already shifted. The way they understand connection is not the same anymore. The way they experience absence is not the same either. Your absence has become more noticeable than your presence once was. It does not feel like simple missing anymore. It feels like something active inside their awareness. Something that stays with them no matter where they go. This creates a cycle. The more they try to move forward, the more they are pulled back into the same realization. Nothing else feels quite the same. Nothing else carries the same emotional weight. And slowly, that comparison starts breaking down their inner resistance. Other experiences begin to feel less meaningful in comparison. Less intense, less real. And that forces a truth into their awareness that they cannot easily dismiss anymore. What they feel cannot simply be replaced or ignored. A quiet tension begins to grow inside them. Not loud, not obvious, but constant. Like a pressure building underneath everything else. Because if something cannot be replaced, then the idea of losing it becomes very real. And that creates fear. This fear does not always show clearly on the outside. Instead, it appears in behavior, in unpredictability, in moments where they seem distant and then suddenly very present. In the push and pull between control and impulse. One part of them wants to move closer, to stop the tension, to finally face what is happening and quiet the noise inside their mind. But another part of them pushes back strongly. That part wants safety, distance, and emotional control. This creates an internal conflict that becomes exhausting over time, because neither side fully wins, and the pressure keeps building between the two. At a deeper level, this is no longer just about feelings. It becomes a question of identity, who they truly are versus who they present themselves to be. The part of them that avoids this connection and the part of them that feels it so strongly cannot continue existing separately without conflict. Eventually, something has to shift. They begin to notice their own patterns more clearly, the avoidance, the distractions, the moments where they try to escape their own thoughts. And this awareness changes everything. Because once someone sees their own avoidance, they can no longer fully unsee it. It creates discomfort, it creates pressure, and it makes returning to old habits harder than before. Even the distance they try to maintain starts to feel unnatural. Even silence begins to feel like something they are doing on purpose, rather than something that is natural. And slowly, emotional numbness stops working the way it used to. Something inside them is changing permanently, and that change is demanding resolution. The mind cannot stay in constant contradiction forever. At some point, it pushes toward a decision. They are approaching that point now, closer than they want to admit. One more emotional wave, one more moment of internal pressure, and the resistance they rely on may no longer hold the same strength. This process does not remain gentle. It does not fade quietly. It moves toward a breaking point where avoidance is no longer possible. The truth becomes too present to ignore. The mind can only handle denial for so long before it starts to collapse under its own contradiction. And right now, there is no clear escape left through distraction or distance. Everything they try to avoid keeps returning. The final stage of this internal struggle is not silence, it is confrontation. A direct facing of what has been growing inside them all along. Whether they feel ready or not, that moment is approaching. At this stage, their inner world begins demanding alignment. What they feel internally can no longer stay separated from what they show externally. That gap creates pressure that keeps increasing until something has to change. Half measures no longer feel sustainable. The mind stops accepting temporary relief. It starts pushing toward resolution, even if it is uncomfortable, even if it requires risk. A decision begins forming quietly inside them, not sudden but unavoidable, built from every moment they tried to ignore, delay, or rationalize what they feel. And as this realization settles deeper, old excuses begin to lose meaning. Delays start to feel artificial. Avoidance begins to feel like self-betrayal. Because living against inner truth has a cost, not immediately but over time. And eventually, that cost becomes too heavy to ignore. They are reaching that point now where continuing to avoid feels harder than facing the truth. Their resistance is not disappearing because they chose to release it. It is weakening because it no longer has strong reasons to hold on. The emotional truth inside them is becoming too clear to deny. Time did not remove what they feel. It made it stronger, clearer, heavier, until there is nowhere left to hide from it. Now silence feels heavier than expression. Distance feels unnatural, and everything inside them is moving toward one unavoidable realization. What they feel is real, and it is not going away. And when that final internal pressure breaks through fully, it will not return quietly. It will come back with intensity that can no longer be contained or ignored.